We're continuing our study of Standard 8. In this unit, we're going to look at Standard 8.2, which is comparing the social and economic policies of Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon. We're going to talk about their support of civil rights legislation, their programs for elderly and poor, environmental protection, and the impact of these policies on politics. Johnson was a Democrat and thought he was being pretty liberal. Nixon was conservative, somewhat moderate. He was a Republican. President Lyndon B. Johnson was a Democrat. He became president in 1963 with the assassination of President Kennedy. He's the next in line of progressives, and his Great Society extended the New Deal. So his policy is going to be very, very similar to like FDR. It's going to follow the examples of the early progressive movement, and then also kind of like the populist as well. Though President Richard Nixon, who was elected in 1968, was a moderate Republican, he really didn't take away the Great Society or the New Deal, so he didn't really change what Lyndon Johnson had done. Johnson had a lot of political experience and expertise. Before he became vice president, he was a majority leader of the House. He served in both the House of Representatives and the Senate. He had an overwhelming majority of Democrats in Congress whenever he was there, so he was able to get a lot of things done. One of the big things he got done was civil rights legislation. In the Civil Rights Act, we talked about a little bit in the previous unit, but here I want to really lay out exactly what the Civil Rights Act did. The Civil Rights Act in 1964 is the benchmark civil rights legislation, and it continues to be important in the United States. It prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Passage of the Act ended the application of Jim Crow laws, which have been upheld by the Supreme Court in Plessy v. Ferguson. The Civil Rights Act was eventually expanded by Congress to strengthen enforcement of these fundamental civil rights. So when we're talking about discrimination of people based on their race, the reason why you can't discriminate people based on their race is because of the Civil Rights Act in 1964. Another huge act that was passed when Johnson was president was the Voting Rights Act. This was passed in the wake of voting demonstrations in Selma, Alabama, and it provided the capstone to many years' efforts to strengthen voting rights for African Americans. 8 states were affected by this in a major way. Not surprisingly, one of those was South Carolina. It might not seem like a real radical concept today, but it might not seem like such a radical concept in 2014, but the Voting Rights Act departed from the pattern of civil rights bills by providing for direct federal action to enable African Americans to register and vote. So basically, the federal government is responsible for making sure that African Americans could register and vote. Previous laws required individuals to file suits in court, a process that often took years to conclude. So now they can appeal directly to the federal government. And then affirmative action is also a part of that. Plan for awarding government contracts were passed over the opposition of conservative Southern Democrats in Congress. Affirmative action is basically the policy where you have to hire or let so many people of a different race into a job to ensure that there's fairness in hiring and going to college. These social policies that were called the Great Society had a profound impact on the lives of African Americans, but it is going to make some white voters in the South mad, and that's why the Democrats in the South are going to start voting Republican in 1968. Johnson's vision is what's called the Great Society. Sometimes it's also known as the War on Poverty, and that's led to establish a Medicare and Medicaid. And really, Obama's kind of like in the same line between Johnson and FDR, very similar policies. Medicare, there was a lack of adequate protection for aged against the cost of health care. And so Medicare was put in place to help people who are elderly get health care. And Medicaid's put in place to help people who were impoverished. It became law in 1965 to assist states in furnishing medical assistance to eligible needy persons. Medicaid is the largest source of funding for medical and health-related services for America's poorest people. The War on Poverty. This is all part of the War on Poverty. President Johnson took on the economy by waging a war on poverty. His vision was to help the disadvantaged, to try to get them to help themselves and to get out of poverty. It doesn't have great success, and like I said, we're still kind of in a war on poverty today, and Obama might not use the same rhetoric, but it's still the same ideas. They also wanted to put in a Head Start program. That's a federal program that promotes the school readiness of children ages birth to 5 from low-income families, by trying to help people who can't really afford it be able to get some of the same advantages that people of higher income can have. like having like reading programs to help those students get into kindergarten on an even playing field. These programs extend the government's commitment to social welfare that started with the New Deal. Johnson's support for civil rights won the African American vote for Democrats. They'd already been voting Democrat because of FDR, but it further strengthens that. And then opposition to this expansion of the federal government, they thought that this was that it was going too far, and it does lead to a resurgence of conservatism when Nixon is elected. And really, what really is the problem with this great society is that the Vietnam War is being fought at the same time, and so you have all the money going towards fighting the war rather than going towards the domestic program, and that's one reason why this isn't as successful as it could have been. Nixon won the 1968 election, in the midst of social conflict about civil rights and the Vietnam War. Remember, there was lots of protest movements during the Vietnam War, and some of that political upheaval included the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy during 1968. Nixon promised to bring an end to the war in Vietnam because the war had become increasingly unpopular. There was a draft that was really unfair towards poor people. African Americans served in large percentages. Protests became increasingly militant and violent and began to lose public support. And then the Tet Offensive happened in January 1968, which is going to lead to a shift in public opinion against the war. His domestic policy included the commitment to limit the efforts to build the Great Society like Lyndon Johnson had wanted, and limited enforcement of civil rights laws. His Southern strategy was designed to gain support from Southern conservatives for the Republican Party, and it works. White people in the South pretty much vote Democrat, if you look at the statistics. Regardless of his efforts, Great Society programs continued, including Medicare and Medicaid, and we still obviously have those to this day. The Democratic Congress passed, and Nixon signed into law landmark environmental legislation, which is kind of unusual for a Republican to support, but he did. The Clean Air and Clean Water Acts and the Endangered Species Act. He also starts the Environmental Protection Agency to help protect the environment. And some people will actually complain about the EPA today and say that it has too much power because you can't build houses or businesses on endangered water or plants, and so it's really like a controversial thing still to this day. Spending on the Vietnam War continued for 5 years after Nixon's election, and that causes a lot of inflation. The economy really collapses near the end of Nixon's administration. It was what's called stagflation, where you had a stagnant economy, but you still had inflation. So it wasn't like people were getting paid more, but the prices of everything were going up. And so stagflation is going to be a major problem in the United States. The Nixon administration is going to intervene to negotiate an end to the OPEC oil boycott because of the United States' economic dependence on foreign oil. Remember, we are so dependent on foreign oil that if OPEC wanted to kind of shut us down there, they didn't send us as much oil, and so that leads to a major economic crisis. And if you wouldn't have solved that, then our economy would have really collapsed. Well, that brings us to the end of 8.2. In this unit, we looked at the two presidencies of Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon. Lyndon Johnson is very famous because of the Great Society and increasing social programs in the war on poverty. Remember the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and also Medicare and Medicaid came out of that. Nixon, while conservative, still kept those parts, but he tried to curtail them a little bit, and he isn't going to enforce civil rights nearly as much as Johnson will. But he is going to put in place protections on the environment. And so that's going to lead us into talking more about liberal and conservative in our later units. Thank you very much for listening. This is the 8.2 video notes. Please take the video quiz and turn in the notes guide. Thank you.